It really is an honor and a privilege for me to be able to provide this presentation. It is something that many of us have experienced in the field of child and youth care, especially child and youth care centers, but not necessarily unique to us. There might be aspects that are, but generally it is something that many of us have experienced. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so when news of the coronavirus surfaced in China and filtered through the noise of our busy lives here at the Durban Child and Youth Care Centre, it was really just news, you know, something that we discussed during coffee. After all, China is a very long way away from Durban. But when the rapid spread of the virus began to dominate the media here locally, we started listening with interest. But we were still in this safe little bubble of ours. After all, we're here at the southernmost tip of Africa. And never once did we consider that the virus would actually be something that impacted us in the way that it has. So when our president first addressed the nation for that first address, we had already begun an awareness drive with our children as well as our staff on washing of hands, not necessarily masks, but definitely washing of hands and just being aware of, you know, how we needed to conduct ourselves and the social distancing that he had spoken about. And yeah, I recall listening to that with quite a sense of smugness and kind of just going tick, 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 yes, we're good, we've got all of that. So a few days later, when he gave his second address, that address had me sitting up very straight. And I must admit that I felt paralyzed by a sense of dread. And it's that gut-wrenching, slightly nauseous feeling, which was one that I soon got used to. So the next few days saw us jump into attention here at the children's home. We had to deal with so many different things, you know, think of so many different aspects. And so between the announcement of level 5 lockdown and 12 o'clock on that Thursday evening before lockdown started on the Friday, we were able to successfully pull together a plan to hold 69 children who were in our centre at that time. And then in addition to that, also our childcare team, as well as our learner child and youth care workers who were with us through the HWC to doing the learnership. And they had volunteered to go into lockdown with our child and youth care team. So we were ready. We really felt that we were ready. And basically the pandemic and the resulting lockdown just made such a mark on us. You know, it took control of our lives. It took control of our program. It really was something that had a life of its own in a sense. And no matter how hard we tried to minimize the impact, the stark reality of how lethal this virus is was something that you know we were not prepared for. And so, as I mentioned before I started the presentation, I am aware, you know, that this experience is by no means unique, as many other child and youth care centres, certainly here in KwaZulu-Natal, but definitely throughout the country have experienced similar challenges to what we did. So basically, child and youth care centres, by their very structure, so the nature of them in terms of the requirements of the Children's Act and the compliance that we need to adhere to, dictates various different restrictions. So in a way, we're already a semi-closed system. And certainly with the Children's Act, it has become far more difficult in a sense for just anyone to have access to the centre. But what we found is that with the various levels of restriction that were imposed by government in its efforts to curb the spread of the virus, that we just became a closed off centre. You know, we became a closed off system. And, you know, to the extent that even those of us who travelled into the centre daily we had to just minimize contact with the children as well as the childcare workers who were working with the children. For level 5, everyone went into lockdown. So those of us who work in the office were in lockdown in our homes and had access via the internet and various different technology that we use to keep in touch with each other. But those in the center, were in the center. So the childcare workers only left the center for those 5 weeks if they needed to take children through to the local clinic. And as I mentioned, a center such as ours is not an open system, but at the same time, it really did create a lot of challenges when we just had to close off in the way that we did. So over time, the impact on our services required the initial crisis planning. We had to come together, and we did that. We moved into action straight away. We actually broke ourselves up into the various different departments and asked people within them to look at how they're going to deal with the 3 weeks, if you recall, because initially it was just 3 weeks and then it was extended to 5. So for instance, we have a catering company that we contract out to for our catering needs, and they needed to come up with a plan for how they get their staff in and out. We had to look at how we, planned the social work program, the domestic program, the support program. Did we have drivers that were available? And fortunately, we had child and youth care workers who were able to assist with that. So we had to jump to attention and then come together and pull together the different ideas to draw up the actual plan. During this period of time, and even into level 4, we found that our reunification services came to almost a complete standstill. During level 5, it was really just communication with family through the telephone system and WhatsApp. But aside from that, parents were not allowed to visit. In fact, those visits had stopped before we even went into lockdown. And that was a very, very difficult time for our children as well as our parents. Many of our parents being very angry, not understanding why it was that we had to make sure that those restrictions were in place. As the restrictions eased, and as you're all aware, we've gone up and down through the various different levels, we had to ensure that there were strict protocols available for visiting, because certainly we looked for opportunities to allow our parents to have access with children. So we had to look at protocols for visiting, and there wasn't anything available. We kept on searching, and eventually through our network and information that we were able to get even from other provinces. So for instance, the Western Cape had some very interesting literature available around different protocols. And so on this and develop our own protocols. And certainly for child and youth care centers in KwaZulu-Natal, they were very similar, but at the same time unique to that particular organization, because some of us are a cottage system, others are different big units with dormitories, and yet others just one big house. So certainly there was a lot of sharing that was done at that time. We were very anxious to get hold of social workers from the various different agencies, and certainly during level 5, that was almost impossible, even during level 4. And as you can understand, many of the children wanted to know what was happening with their families, and there were cases where we weren't able. And normally we would use the agency social worker to assist with this. But really that wasn't something that was very easily available to us. The domestic services that we have to support the child and youth care program within each of our different units was something that we were very concerned about, because we knew the importance of keeping the environment hygienic And we had all different protocols around, you know, sanitizing and keeping surfaces clean. But during the lockdown, our domestic team who are not residential were not able to come in to provide those services. And so the bulk of the responsibility fell onto the childcare workers. And then in the 2 units that we have, where we have adolescent children that were shared out with the adolescent children, who were very helpful and very willing to assist. But it certainly did put a lot of pressure on the childcare staying in the program. Our volunteer program closed even before level 5, and although there have been times that we've tried to reopen it, it just has never been able to get off the ground again. Aside from the levels moving up and down, there's also, of course, the challenge with access to the Child Protection Register as well as the Sex Offenders Register. There's a backlog for people trying to get their clearances around that. So that program has remained closed since the beginning of level 5 lockdown. And we don't really see that that's going to change, possibly. If it does, it'll only be in the new year. We then had to look at the program for children. And we realized that that had to be adjusted. We had to put a lot of emphasis on planned daily activities to keep children occupied. And so just as an example, this is a program for one of our units, the Amakawa unit. And we set out very, very clearly to assist childcare workers excuse me, on you know, how to set their routine for the day from wake up time, and it went right through to sleep time. And as you can see, we put in for academic time because we didn't want children to get out of the rhythm of school attendance. This became more and more difficult for us to motivate our teenagers to attend. We did find that as the weeks went by and with all the uncertainty around when schools would reopen, that it was quite difficult for us to keep them motivated. And there you can see that there were structured activities that were planned, and you know, the childcare workers were responsible for this, and we had to make sure that these activities were kept fun and that it wasn't the same boring stuff that was done time after time. We also found that our social workers had to do a lot more one-on-one counseling. So initially, during the first 5 weeks of lockdown, the social worker, one of our social workers who lives closest to the center, was able to come in from time to time just to physically check on children and staff. And that was a huge support for both the children and staff. As soon as we moved into level 5, then counseling did. And we found that we needed to use tools with children, especially the younger children, to help them express themselves. And certainly access to the web was very helpful. Through the internet, we were able to pick up a lot of different tools that the social workers were able to use, even booklets that were printed and given to the childcare workers and then became part of the activities to help children express their feelings, also just to educate them on what was happening in the world as well as here in South Africa. It was very important to us that we kept the link between children and family as consistent as possible. And so we had to think as creatively as possible. And so even though children who are under the age of 16 do not have access or not allowed to have access here in our program, the childcare workers were very kind and allowed children to speak with their parents via WhatsApp. We also spoke about the possibility of even allowing children and family to do video calling. But we didn't realize at the time, you know, that would put a lot of strain on families who would not have the data to actually be able to incorporate the video calling. But you know, if the means had been different, and maybe if we'd had a bit more time to think it through, and funds available, that would have been something that would have certainly made children feel a lot more comfortable being able to actually see their family members when they were speaking to them. Another thing that was impacted on was the needs of staff, and then balancing that with the needs of children, because our staff, many of whom have their own children, had volunteered to go into lockdown. Many of them had left their children with either older children or with family members, and then didn't get the opportunity to see them for that entire period of time. We were also aware that as much as children were feeling very frustrated, that our staff also were feeling quite anxious, and they were also feeling quite concerned about what was happening and needing to spend time with their families. And so we saw that there was a huge amount of emotion. It's almost like the center became a hot pot full of different emotions. Fear was massive in some of the drawing activities that children did. They expressed the fear of actually dying. There was great concern about the possibility of family members dying and them not being able to see their family, or that they'd never see their family again. There was also the importance of recognizing and naming guilt, and that was around those of us who were not, couldn't be, you know, here every day, those of us who work in the office, the admin section. We felt very guilty about not being here to support the childcare team and not being here for the children, especially the social workers who have a lot of contact with children. So that was quite a difficult thing, and we needed to actually express that. We needed to name it. We needed to look at how we could be as involved as possible. And so, for instance, engaging with children through Zoom meetings was one of the things that a senior childcare worker set up for us. In addition to that, there was also a WhatsApp group that we formed for communication between those of us that were not on the property and the childcare workers. Excuse me, and we were able to send inspirational messages and just share information on a regular basis. The focus really became on day-to-day living, because we couldn't necessarily do much planning. We had the plan in place, but the focus was on day-to-day living. The program, the example which I gave you, was something that was flexible. So childcare workers were aware that if necessary, they could make changes within the framework of the day. Education was something that really was a concern for us. Many of our children have challenges when it comes to their academic ability, and a period of time when nothing was happening was going to really place them at a disadvantage. So it became very important for us to schedule in academic time. And that was very structured and was something that childcare workers took responsibility for. Excuse me. We were very fortunate to have 2 child and youth care workers that are in fact working towards a degree in education. So they were able to draw on their training to assist in developing developing specific activities for the various different grades. And then the last area, you know, just it wasn't necessarily an impact in a negative way on services, but certainly helpful, is that just a short while before lockdown happened, we had managed to make both our properties Wi-Fi zones. So that allowed our staff to be able to have access with family members on a regular basis. they were able to access that without having to keep on buying data. And then also there was access to the internet and being able to do research and find activities and, just everything that went into what we were doing. So the Zoom meetings and all the rest of it, all of that was made possible because we had the Wi-Fi zones available to us. Impact on children, there was this intense, hot pots of emotions, as I spoke about. And some of these emotions were very, very real for children. There was fear, there was frustration, there was anger. There was a lot of feeling hopeless. There was a sense of guilt. Certainly for many of the children, when the older children, when the media spoke about, how difficult it was for people to access food, they were very concerned about their family members not being able to eat while they were able to access their meals here at the children's home. So it was really important that our childcare workers created the space for them to be able to express themselves and talk feelings. And that's where the one-on-one counseling with the social workers was also helpful. And that's not taking away what the childcare workers did, because the childcare workers were doing the ad hoc counseling in the life space as the need arose, and then referring social workers when children were requiring a bit more support around the various different emotions that they were experiencing. Another thing that was a huge challenge was obviously boredom. As much as we had our structured activity program in place and our daily program, any of you who have teenagers will know that it doesn't matter what you put under their noses, their first response will be that is boring. And so the childcare workers working in our adolescent units were specifically challenged around this boredom, this word boredom. And so they really had to go all out to ensure that there were interesting programs. And of course, over time, it doesn't really matter how exciting a program sounds when it has to happen within the same four walls. It really does make it difficult to motivate children to have that sense of excitement and be open to something different. We saw how many of our children lost their confidence. There was just this being closed in and not being able to speak to anyone except the faces that were here every day. The lack of volunteers. Volunteers really bring a breath of fresh air when they come into organizations such as ours, because they come in with different experiences and different stories to share with children. And so we just saw that our children really lost their confidence. Many of them also just losing their sense of hope. What use is it going to school? What use is it learning if the world is never going to be a safe place for us to be in? So that was something that we saw happening with our children. And then, of course, the greatest impact was how they fell behind academically. It didn't matter how much we put in place. And I don't for one minute think that what we put in place didn't help in some way. But it was only in the first term of this year that we saw just how much the rotational system had taken away from our children in terms of their access to FaceTime with teachers in school. And schools were great. They did their best, but it really was difficult for our children. Not only those, with special educational needs, but just generally, because as I mentioned earlier, many of them do struggle academically. The impact on staff was also felt. We obviously had to negotiate with our childcare team. they made sacrifices. They made huge sacrifices. And I think what for me was probably the most humbling was the day that I met with the childcare team to talk through what the 3 weeks of lockdown was going to mean and how we really needed people to be available. But, you know, considering what it entailed and the fact that we were cognizant of them having their own families, and also keeping in mind that this all happened, you know, at around payday. And generally people would use that time to go and buy groceries and then visit their families and leave groceries for the next 2 weeks until they had their next weekend off. And now suddenly we were going into lockdown, and many of our child and youth care workers don't live locally. And were then really scrambling to try and ensure that their families had the necessary provisions. So it was very humbling when at that meeting, every single one of our childcare workers said, we're all doing this together, we're in this together. If we all go into lockdown together, it means that we can share duty times, we can be a support to each other. And we had students from doing a learnership with us, child and youth care students who volunteered to support our childcare workers. And that was a huge plus. It really was a huge plus. Of course, our childcare workers had enormous guilt that they had to deal with, leaving their families behind, and also recognizing that they had children that were going through the same emotions that our children were going through. And, you know, just realizing that they were giving 100% to the children in the children's home and just being very concerned about what was happening with their children. The support structure became very important. So the WhatsApp group, the online supervision, both our supervisors were here on the property as well, together with our childcare manager. So the support offered by those three online was very helpful. The daily inspirational messages definitely helped all of us. And then sharing information as it came through. So, you know, we just made sure that everything that we found or everything that we heard, and it was a two-way, you know, so one of our childcare workers, for instance, shared information around an immune booster that we then bought the ingredients for and made available to all staff, all children. So we were able to share, you know, the sharing was from both sides. Then just there was the emotional fatigue that we needed to consider, even though our childcare workers were able to support each other and weren't necessarily working long hours, they were still bound and on the property. And having to deal with the intense emotions of children together with their own fears and concerns was something that drained them. For those that worked with the younger children, there was also the physical fatigue, because those children obviously need a different kind of care. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of bathing, dressing, bedtime, supervising while those children are playing. So we were very aware that there was, you know, those two things that we needed to consider, emotional fatigue as well as the physical fatigue. A positive was that our childcare workers became far more tech savvy, and that was something that, you know, we had as part of our plan. So that happened a lot faster than what we had anticipated. And it's been really great to see how we've been able to retain those skills as time has gone by. We also needed to create timeout spaces for our child and youth care workers. That was really quite critical, so that they could have space where children weren't, outside of the restrooms that we have in the actual units. Fortunately, we were able to identify 2 separate buildings, small buildings, one on each of our 2 properties, and they were able to go in there during their off time and watch TV and just hang out. And then we also made sure that through supervision, as well as access to the social workers, child and youth care workers did receive support. So they were, in terms of being able to speak about the anxiety that they were feeling for their own families in a more structured way than just, the general as they were passing each other. We also saw that there was an impact on our finances. The closure of the volunteer program is something that has impacted. And now, 18 months later, we can really see the effect of that. This is specifically around the CSR projects, because generally corporates would run or would approach us and say they'd like their staff team to come in and do some kind of maintenance project for us. And of course, none of that has happened since last year, March of last year. And we've seen how that's impacted. There's so many areas within our program. We are based in very, very old houses. And without that annual TLC, we can see how it's impacted on the physical property. The CSR budgets of many of these companies has also been slashed. And so where in the beginning, there were a few companies who said, well, this money had been allocated for our CSR projects, so we can give you the cash towards PPE, for instance. Now that is no longer happening. And then the donor base that we have seen how, and purely because of the economy and people losing jobs, there's been an attrition within that database. We've been touched to see how people have continued to give in spite of the challenges, because the economy has obviously affected everyone. But certainly there have been those people who have lost jobs, and so it has been impossible for them to continue donating. We've also seen how trusts and foundations have been giving smaller awards, and we can only assume that this is one because of the greater demand that is placed on them. Their means can't meet the demand, and so they're trying to share it out. And then also with the economy, being under the strain that it is, one would assume there's been also less income from investments. In addition to that, there was no increase to subsidy in this past financial year and in this year that we're in now. And, that always does create stress on the finances of the organization. And then there was also the additional cost of meeting the requirements of PPE and ensuring that there was sufficient of that, both for children as well as for staff. There was an impact on the field here in KZN, and I'm pleased to be able to say it was all positive. We saw that there was greater networking. In 2019, we were fortunate to be able to pull together a network that allowed almost all of the registered child and youth care centres in KZN to be linked through emails. And so we saw that there was greater use of that particular resource. And certainly it was very helpful because we were able to share information as it came through. So there was more effective collection and dissemination of information. We also saw that organizations shared with each other. If someone had more masks than what they needed, they would put it out there, and so we were able to share resources, but not only physical, also the intellectual resources. There was the manager, in fact, Fiona from Pietermaritzburg Children's Home, who worked very, very hard to develop protocols and guidelines for child and youth care centres, and that was something that we were able to share not only here in KwaZulu-Natal, but throughout the country. And then lastly, we also had to develop organizational policy. There was not much in the way of guidelines from the Department of Social Development. This was at the time that we were in level 4 and level 5 lockdown. And so we needed to provide policy and make sure that we had that in place. And so we were able to share with each other and draw on each other for that information. Okay, so just looking at, the main lessons that we learned, I pulled together these ideas because obviously I've reflected on this quite a lot over the last year and a half. And certainly it's felt that what got us through, and is what is still getting us through, is inspirational leadership. Without it, it just seems hopeless. And I think that it was, for me personally, when our president, in one of his addresses, spoke about how we are building this aeroplane together as we fly in it. I really hung on to that. And that was very inspirational for me personally, as the director here at the children's home, because if our president was saying, I can't really answer all these questions because I'm not sure, but I'm trusting this process, and if you come along with the ride for me, if you come along for the ride with me, I'm sure we'll reach our destination, that I could emulate that here at the children's home. And so certainly it feels that, if we're going to provide effective leadership in times of crisis, then we need to be able to be inspirational. We also need to be honest. Honesty is very important. And so when we don't know the answers and when we're not sure, we need to say it. We need to have the courage to say it. We need to say that very clearly, but at the same time, we also need to be sure that we can give a sense of confidence that, yes, I don't know the answer, but that doesn't mean that I'll never know the answer. I might just not know it right now. So I found that honesty definitely worked, and certainly having the courage to face what we don't know, but knowing that in time we would know. It was a little bit of a strange way of thinking about things, but it certainly was something that was true for us here at Durban Child and Youth Care Centre. And then also just having humility, there were many, many times that we didn't have the answers. And there were many times when we had to respond to children and staff by admitting that we didn't have the answers. So, with the honesty had to be a certain amount of humility. We also found that experience does count. It certainly does count. We're very fortunate to have a team of workers who've worked together over decades. And if we add all our years of experience together, it's hundreds, if not thousands of years of experience. And certainly that experience counts. It just keeps you grounded, it keeps you centered, and it gives you a sense that it doesn't matter, because we'll get through this. We won't necessarily be the same, but we will get through this. A supportive board is gold in time of a crisis. And certainly we were very fortunate to have, and we have, an amazing board that were supportive, that were there for us, that were able to offer advice when called upon, but didn't put any undue pressure on us at all, but certainly gave us a lot of encouragement. The other thing, and I probably realized this during this pandemic more than at any other time, is that crisis truly is an opportunity for growth. Faced with the crisis of this magnitude, we've seen how we have been able to use it for positive. And we saw that when we had to deal with the looting and unrest here in KZN just a few months ago. The manner in which we approached that was with far more confidence than what we would have before the pandemic. We were just able to kind of jump to action straight away. We knew what we needed to do. We knew what, was going to assist children and staff and families. And so we were able to do it. And so from all of this, definitely, we've seen how we've become more resilient. Certainly, we know that resilience develops over time and allows for quick recovery and confidence to face new challenges. And the one thing that we know for sure is that there is going to be another challenge. There is going to be another crisis. We just don't know when, but that is life. And we know that from what we've learned during lockdown, we will be able to face it with far more courage than what we did before. And finally, one of the requirements is faith. Truly without faith, without believing that all things are possible, and when we place our faith in God, then none of what we were able to achieve would have been possible. We had to have the courage just to step out in faith, and we just hold on to that and know that that will see us through. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mandy. We were listening to you. You were wonderful, and all the presentation actually went very well. But before we let you go, there are questions that came through, and some of them actually you were able to answer them while you were going through your presentation. So thank you so much. But the question that I would like you to also look at is that how young people were involved in decision-making around the programs, as we are talking about the lesson learned in lockdown.
Right. So in in the slideshow, there were the 3 slides that set out the program in one of the units that we have. So you would see that there were different times set aside for different things. So the academic program, the activity, the free time, all that kind of thing. In each of the units, we have a weekly cottage meeting where children prepare for, under normal circumstances, the weekend activity if they're going to be in the program. So all those processes were still happening, but we needed to make sure that we provided guidelines that were going to be applied by the child and youth care workers to ensure that there was uniformity between all the different units. So the schedule was not necessarily prescriptive in terms of the specific activities that needed to be done, but it was to provide the structure, the containment, which both children and staff, the childcare staff, needed to feel safe at a time when things really were feeling quite crazy. But in terms of the actual activities, especially the children, between the ages of 10 upwards, they were involved in deciding. And as I said, teenagers are bored, so it doesn't matter what you put in front of them, they're going to say, no, that's boring. So the strategy that our childcare workers used with them was to say, what ideas do you have? And if they didn't have ideas, to give them a range of ideas, and then from them, allow them to choose what they wanted to do on that particular day. I hope that answers it clearly enough.
Yeah, it does. Lastly, before we leave you, there's another question. How did you manage to restore, rebuild on some of the challenges young people were experiencing? I think this question came when you were on your slide, you were talking about impact on finances. Now, e.g., academic, as still some schools are not fully operational, or perhaps there was external support.
Okay, so during the 5 weeks of lockdown, there was no external support. It was just drawing on the 2 child and youth care workers that we employ, who have been studying towards their Bachelor of Education. So they were able to give some structure to that academic program. once we started going back to school on the rotational system, and that still applies for most of the schools that our children attend now, we had to look at that academic support program and make it far more structured. We just recently have been able to secure some funding from a donor who has covered the cost of us packaging their program so it's more effective, so it becomes more remedial, if I can put it in that way. And then also the cost of the person who's actually providing that service, dedicated to providing that service for our children. Because even prior to COVID-19, one of the challenges was for our child and youth care workers to provide homework supervision for children, because we're not teachers, we're child and youth care workers, and many of our children, come with, like for instance, maths. I would be helpless and hopeless in trying to help someone with that homework. So I completely understood when childcare workers were saying, we're very limited in what we can do here. And so that's where our volunteer program was a huge help, because the volunteers used to come in and give specialized attention to specialized subjects for children. But of course, that's all fallen away. So we had to use the more focused attention of the academic support program.
Thank you so much, Liz. Reading from the comments, I can see that Elizabeth is saying, if I was a child and youth care worker starting out, this would definitely be a child and youth care center that I would join. So I think she's actually pleased with the presentation and everything.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our participants, and thank you so much to you, Mandy, for making yourself available for this session. This is the end of our session. I think we were able to respond to all the questions. So I think there's another session that is following. I think it was about to start at 3:30. So I think we are a bit late to join it, but we can still make it. So yes, thank you. Have a lovely afternoon and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.